The rise of the Third Reich. One of the most brutal conflicts in history. Nearly 70 years after the fall of the Third Reich, the dark legacy of Hitler's regime still shadows the lives of its descendants.
I'm responsible as my father's son for what has happened.
Ich kannte niemand anders, dessen Großvater ein Nazi war oder dessen Großvater ein Verbrecher war irgendwo. Ich hatte das Gefühl, das ist irgendwie nur in meiner Familie so, weil ich wirklich von niemand wusste, wo das auch so ist.
I wouldn't even admit before to myself or anybody that I was feeling so guilty, since it didn't make any sense to feel guilty for myself, since I didn't do anything.
Altaussee, Austria, was considered the Nazis' nest. Today, its peaceful landscape belies its dark past. It has become a destination of reconciliation and dialogue between descendants of Nazis and of Holocaust survivors.
Extreme judgment of my ancestors had anything to do with me cutting the line. To maybe, I mean, there was an element of it, to be afraid to bring somebody maybe who has part of that monster in them.
With the fall of the Third Reich, Nazi perpetrators and their families attempted to move away from their cruel history, leading lives that gave them the appearance of ordinary families, but the hard truth lies in wait.
My father, every year for Christmas, he's standing there at the Christmas tree, singing festive Christmas hymn in his finest suits with this knight's cross around his neck.
My mom had a tailor business. In our flat, in one of the big rooms, we had another family. She was like our housekeeper, and she was like, I called her mom too. So I grew up with a lot of love in different ways. I felt actually, in a lot of ways, fortunate to grow up in that family. I felt like a positive person, like anything was possible.
Ich komme aus einer ganz normalen Familie, was immer auch normal ist, und hatte eine gute Beziehung zu meinen Eltern. Aber über Dinge, die richtig schwierig sind, haben wir zu Hause nie gesprochen.
My father was a war hero. He was bearing this Knight's Cross, which was awarded to him for the accomplishment and one of the highest awards for a young mid-20 tank commander.
Bernd's father, who believed he had served his country with honor, was unable to reframe his accomplishment in the face of Germany's defeat and remained stubbornly proud of his role in the war.
Trying to understand, specifically my father, who dedicated a lot of time to teach me, to make me a person. I looked up to him. And on the other hand, he's telling me stories about him in the war, and I didn't know what kind of war he was talking about. I was a child.
Diese Waffen schmiedet pausenlos das schaffende Deutschland für den letzten entscheidenden Kampf.
As I remember, always told me that the war was the best time in his life and that he was very proud of his accomplishments.
Fällt mir nicht leicht, über meine Familie zu sprechen und über meinen Großvater.
What was a source of pride for their ancestors, the descendants experienced as a source of despair.
Als ich Kind war, da gab es den Großvater eigentlich überhaupt gar nicht in der Familie. Und ich weiß auch nie, warum ich nie gefragt habe über den Großvater. Ich dachte wahrscheinlich, der ist schon tot oder keine Ahnung.
It was, I think, more in my teens that I started realizing what was going on there, that I started researching it, that the Holocaust came up. I mean, it was like something that was in the background that everybody knew, but nobody talked about particularly.
Totschweigen, a German word meaning to make death disappear by silence.
The realization, the slow realization what really happened, that shaped my life from very early on.
The tacit denial of the past by their families did nothing to protect the descendants from it. The next generation awoke to this brutal and terrifying knowledge, unprepared, overwhelmed, and suddenly alone.
There's a few key things I remember, like that we were watching TV, and there was a documentary on the Holocaust. And my grandmother said, "It's all lies, it's all lies." And we went like, no way. My brother and me, we were very angry at her, I remember.
The realization by subsequent generations of what their ancestors had done was often belated and shocking.
Als wir in der Schule über den Holocaust sprachen, war ich schon komplett schockiert. Aber irgendwie war das schon abstrakt. Die Nazis waren irgendwelche Monster oder Täter. Und plötzlich war es mein eigener Großvater.
Friedrich Wilhelm Boger, Ursula's grandfather, was an SS Hauptsturmführer at Auschwitz, an SS staff sergeant. He devised the Boger swing. The victim was bound hand and foot, set swinging from a beam, and whipped, often to death. Boger, the architect of this sadistic instrument of torture, described its cruel purpose this way: "We helped those too tired to go on."
Ich kannte niemand anders, dessen Großvater ein Nazi war oder dessen Großvater ein Verbrecher war irgendwo. Ich hatte das Gefühl, das ist irgendwie nur in meiner Familie so, weil ich wirklich von niemandem wusste, wo das auch so ist. Und ich komplett allein einfach damit war. Und ich hatte nächtelang Albträume, schlimme Albträume.
I was ashamed to face the fact that my father was not a hero. Yes, he was a hero for himself, was awarded a cross, a Knight's Cross, which I deeply resented over the course of time. It was for me literally the embodiment of evil.
Bernd's father, Arthur Vollschlager, confers with Heinrich Himmler, Reich SS leader and chief of the German police. The consummate German officer, he wears the Knight's Cross, which acknowledges his bravery in breaking through Russian lines to conquer the town of Orel. Adolf Hitler awarded the cross personally. One of the youngest tank commanders in the German army, Vollschlager took part in the most critical battles in the Second World War. Bernd's father's support of Hitler's regime did not waver in the years after the war.
There was this discrepancy. My father, who supposedly should provide me the values and the guidance in life, and be my father, and the father whom I despised.
My grandmother, she was very uppity, like always thinking she was better than everybody else, and I really disliked her for that. It wasn't particularly about Hermann Göring, but I knew she sort of represented that family.
To be a descendant of Hermann Göring means to belong to one of the most influential families in the Third Reich. Göring was the architect of the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, Germany's Air Force, and as Hitler's designated successor, he was second in command in the Third Reich. It was Göring who authorized the final solution to the Jewish question. He was Bettina's great-uncle. She was born 10 years after his death.
And most of the time I spent with my mother because my father worked in a town outside Bamberg. And I remember her saying, "Why do you have to poke in the past? We all suffered. We were all victims." And I couldn't believe that.
At the war's end, the German populace was faced with destruction, confusion, and a scarcity of food.
She could not understand that I was identifying and searching answers from the victims of the Nazis.
But for Bernd, the suffering of the German population after the war had no parallel to the cruelties perpetrated by the Nazi regime.
My father comes from Poland, and he was born in 1912 and was a sculptor in Paris in the mid-1930s. He went back to Poland to try to save his parents as the war broke out. He ended up in the Lodz ghetto with much of his family, and then he ended up in Auschwitz concentration camp, and from Auschwitz to a smaller labor camp called Gerlitz. And in his family, many people were murdered, but he survived.
When the war ended, Samson's father and brothers were reunited at a displaced persons camp in Germany. This family photo was taken there in 1946. Samson's mother, Greta, endured extraordinary suffering. Her story of survival is both miraculous and harrowing.
My mother also went to Auschwitz, and she went from Auschwitz to a small division of Gross-Rosen, and then from Gross-Rosen to Bergen-Belsen. So she spent about 2 years in concentration camps. She had a very hard experience and became what is known as a Musulman. These are people who are walking dead. Their hair stops growing and their fingernails stop growing and they're almost dead. And she developed typhus and was unconscious and was placed in a pile of dead bodies in Bergen-Belsen by the Nazis. And then the war ended and the British arrived. And she heard them because she had awakened in this pile in the dark with bodies over her.
13,000 people died in the weeks following liberation. For them,
and so she called out to them and startled them because a voice came from the pile of bodies. And they dug her out. Her parents, both parents were murdered, and multiple other family members were murdered.
Greta was orphaned. In 1947, Greta emigrated to the United States, where she met Samson's father. Two lives shattered by a cruel past came together to create a better future. Destruction, shattered lives, family ties broken. This is the legacy of the Third Reich, a new language of cruelty that has marked the lives of the descendants of the victims and perpetrators of the Holocaust. While the perpetrators indulged in silence and denial, their descendants struggled with knowledge of these dark truths, absorbing the guilt, shame, and pain for deeds they never committed.
It's really looking into the darkest darkness of that whole issue of my uncle, of my guilt.
Do you still say that neither Hitler nor you knew of the policy to exterminate the Jews?
Soweit es mich betrifft, habe ich gesagt, dass
I already have said that not even approximately did I know to what degree this thing took place.
You did not know to what degree, but you knew there was a policy that aimed at the liquidation of the Jews.
Nein, auf die Auswanderung der Juden und nicht auf ihre
No, not liquidation of the Jews.
This document, dated July 31st, 1941, states plainly that Göring gave written authorization to SS Obergruppenführer, Chief of the Reich Main Security Office, to make all necessary preparations for the final solution to the Jewish question, the systematic genocide of 6 million European Jews.
As for the individual, Wilhelm Hermann Göring, guilty of conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Death by hanging.
Hermann Göring, a key figure in the Third Reich, commander of the Luftwaffe, architect of the Gestapo, and Hitler's designated successor, is placed in solitary confinement to await the execution that never arrives. Göring committed suicide by swallowing a cyanide capsule smuggled into his cell the night before his scheduled execution. Believing himself a martyr, he is alleged to have cautioned the prison warden, "I will go down in history, don't you forget that."
After such catastrophes, the first generation is not able to cope with them. Then they are transmitted subconsciously to the next generation and then to third and fourth generation. It can go on many generations, grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Although they are innocent, but they carry the guilt within them, or the shame also, to belong to such a family, and they try to cope with it.
My father was a tough father. I could never address him as daddy. I could never hug him. I could never kiss him. I was told that I had to be a German. I had to show no emotion. Crying in front of him was a major cause for punishment. I had to be tough. I had to be better. I had to achieve. And I would call it tough love. Deep in his heart, he was loving me. I knew that. But he didn't show it, and I was not allowed to show it to him.
Bernd's father's expectations of his son corresponded to what the Nazi regime had expected of him. The Nazi agenda was expressed in all aspects of German education.
In 1933, there was a propaganda book published called Die deutsche Mutter und ihr erstes Kind, the German mother and her first child, about how to raise your children, and which means personal needs and emotion had to be repressed.
Oh, my great-grandfather was an officer in the Franco-Prussian War. My grandfather was an officer in the First World War. My father was an officer in the Second World War. This was a family of officers serving their country. In addition, my father, very early on, was sent to a boarding school, which was created right after Hitler's rise to power, which was called the National Political Education Institute, NAPOLA. And NAPOLA was, I would call it the West Point for Nazis, for future leaders of the new Germany, to modify that, future leaders of the new Germany, that the Nazi party had envisioned the Übermensch, the Superman, and it was very tough education, extremely rough, and he told me about that. And actually he was proud that he was able to go through this education, and he expected for me to be as tough too.
The educational system during the Nazi period was based on a pedagogy which promoted racial superiority of Aryan characteristics above all others. A system that promoted the dehumanization of the other and produced individuals who were committed to and supportive of the atrocities perpetrated by the Nazi regime.
When I was drafted to the German military, mandatory draft in the time of the Cold War, and I refused. I wrote a letter back to the draft board claiming that I'm a conscientious objector, based on the fact that I don't want to serve in the same army like my father served under an army and serving in a demon. And he was not upset at all. He just asked me, why are you doing this? I don't want to do what you have done. He wrote a letter to the draft board, which I still have today. My name is Arthur Reinhard Wollschläger. I'm a lieutenant colonel in the German army. I served my country, but my country abandoned me after the war. I don't know for what I served. And I don't want my son to go through the same experience. I often thought about the issue of closure. How can I reconnect with my father in what shape or form? I can't physically because he's dead. And we broke up literally physically. I parted from the house. I emigrated to Israel. First of all, his only son became a Jew after a long process. I emigrated to Israel immediately afterwards. I disconnected from the family totally, physically, and we never saw each other.
The descendant of a line of proud German military officers, the son of a staunch Nazi, refuses to serve in the German army, converts to Judaism, and immigrates to Israel, where he serves in the Israeli army for 2 years as a medical officer at the rank of captain.
I often envisioned if he would have sit down with me one day and said, son, I need to talk with you about that. This is what happened. This is what I saw. I'm deeply sorry. I cannot change it. I'm proud for what I did as an officer, but I'm ashamed what my country did. There was a way, and I wish my father would have at least after the war understood that it is time now to make clean house and to say, I made a mistake. I have to live up to the fact that whatever I did was not right. And I should not reconnect to my old comrades, celebrating the good old times, making my son aware that this was the best time of my life. How could it have been the best time of your life if you ignored the fact which you knew? My father knew what happened. He told me one day. And one day he admitted to me point blank, yes, we knew. So what? You should have at least realized and said, and not glorify the war to me. I would have loved you as a father anyway. But now I cannot respect you.
The Nazi regime left its mark on the lives of all Germans for decades to come. Not only the lives of these children, but in turn the lives of their children, often the indirect victims of Nazi education. Berlin, soon after the war. The ghosts of the Third Reich wander among the rubble of a destroyed city. The birth of a new generation is not enough to dispel them. Despite the fact that Bettina was born nearly a decade after Göring's death by suicide, her familial connection continues to be a source of personal struggle.
There have been so many different stages in that process. I mean, there was a time in my teens, then later when my father died, and I wasn't that ready to really talk publicly. Oh, it was still processing, and it only started really with this Bloodlines documentary.
Bettina's deeper understanding of Hermann Göring's role in the Holocaust began many years later with her participation in the documentary Bloodlines, an exploration by filmmaker Cynthia Conop, in which Bettina engages in conversation with artist Ruth Rich, whose brother perished in the Holocaust.
That's a gas, yeah?
Mm-hmm. He called that one the final solution.
She pushed me to a place that I probably would have never gone by myself, which is really looking into the darkest darkness of that whole issue of my uncle, of my guilt.
So the nice part of you is also the nice part of him.
Yeah.
But there's something lurking.
And there's part of that that's also in me, that's capable of doing that. All of that.
Together, Bettina and Ruth came to a deeper understanding of the history that so impacted both of their lives, opening a path towards healing.
Feel.
I wasn't particularly clear until we did the Bloodlines documentary how involved he was in the Holocaust himself. I mean, in some ways I knew he was involved, but that he was more directly involved, I wasn't aware of.
While participating in Bloodlines, Bettina became aware of her ancestors' pivotal role in the final solution. The fear that this connection might express itself in her life affects her most intimate and personal decisions.
Like in that scene I grew up with, in the hippie scene, alternative scene, it was very common not to have children in my generation. I definitely had big issues with having children and not having children. I knew I had issues and I didn't know why.
In an interview at Nuremberg, Hermann Göring made this disturbing prediction. "I have always been interested in family history. Chromosomes are funny things, aren't they? They may skip a generation, and you can find children who resemble the grandfather rather than either parent. Heredity is more important than environment. Blood will tell."
My extreme judgment of my ancestors had anything to do with me cutting the line. To maybe, I mean, there was an element of it, to be afraid to bring somebody maybe who has part of that monster in them. There seems to be a lot of ghosts still around.
Ursula Boger has carried the heavy burden of her family history and remains haunted by nightmares as she confronts the ghosts.
Als ich 13 oder 14 Jahre alt war, sprachen wir in der Schule über den Holocaust. Und mein Lehrer hat erzählt, dass sein Vater oder Großvater im Holocaust umgekommen ist. Und es hat mich sehr berührt und sehr bewegt. Und ich bin nach Hause gekommen und habe es meiner Mutter erzählt. Und alles, was meine Mutter damals sagte, war, ja, dein Großvater war auch in Auschwitz, aber als Täter. Und das war alles, was sie sagte damals. Und ich hatte damals das Gefühl, ich verliere komplett den Boden unter meinen Füßen. Ich wusste nicht, mit wem ich drüber reden kann. Es war irgendwie klar, in unserer Familie wird nicht darüber geredet.
Wilhelm Boger, Ursula's grandfather, a principal actor in the crimes committed at Auschwitz, continued his life and work with impunity. For more than a decade after the war, he worked as a clerk at Heinkel, producers of German motorcycles, near his hometown, until the day he was arrested in 1958. When this happened, Ursula had not yet been born. Only in the mid-1990s did she discover the painful truth.
Und dann hat viele Jahre später, als ich 24 war, mein Bruder mir am Telefon erzählt, dass es eine Dokumentation gibt, ein Buch über den Auschwitz-Prozess, wo mein Großvater einer der Angeklagten war.
In 1963, the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial brought the criminals of Auschwitz to justice, among them Wilhelm Borger. As he entered the courtroom, Borger remained unrepentant and embittered, even in his last moments of freedom.
Vor einem Jahr am Anfang eines Prozesses, der bereits jetzt als Auschwitz-Prozess in die deutsche Geschichte eingegangen ist. 24 deutsche Männer haben sich seit einem Jahr vor einem Frankfurter Schwurgericht für ihre Tätigkeit in der größten bisher bekannten Menschenvernichtungsanlage zu verantworten. Der bisher umfassendste strafrechtliche Versuch, ein Stück deutscher Vergangenheit zu bewältigen, kreist um die Konzentrationslager Auschwitz und Birkenau.
Und musste dann realisieren, dass mein Großvater nicht nur irgendein Täter in Auschwitz war, sondern einer der schlimmsten Folterer in Auschwitz war. Und ich glaube, in dem Buch zu lesen, ist für jeden absoluter Horror. Es ist einfach so unmenschlich und so brutal, was dort beschrieben wird. Oh.
What follows is testimony given by Hermann Langbein, secretary of the International Commission of Auschwitz and a survivor of the infamous concentration camp.
Ich habe gesehen, wie einmal zum Verhör gerufen worden ist. Und ich habe ihn gesehen, wie zurückgekommen ist. Er war auf die Schaukel gespannt. Und entschuldigen Sie, wenn ich das jetzt so schildere, seine Geschlechtsteile waren derart geschwollen, blau und grün, als er zurückkam, wie ich es mir nicht hätte vorstellen können, dass das überhaupt möglich ist. Die Spezialität vom Borger hat darin bestanden, dass er eben auf diese Körperteile besonders seine Schläge gerichtet hat.
In her testimony, Frau Borger depicts her husband as a good man and claims to have known nothing about his role in the SS or at Auschwitz.
Frau Borger, wie lange sind Sie jetzt verheiratet?
Ich bin ca. 24 Jahre verheiratet.
Wenn Sie jetzt zurückblicken nach 24 Jahren, wie beurteilen Sie Ihr Familienleben?
Das war sehr gut und wir haben sehr harmonisch gelebt.
Waren Sie zusammen mit Ihrem Mann in Auschwitz?
Ja.
Ja, wie beurteilen Sie die Vorwürfe, die Ihrem Mann jetzt gemacht werden?
Ich kann mir das nicht vorstellen, dass er das alles gemacht haben soll. Mein Mann war zwar sehr genau, aber dass er Kinder ermordet haben soll, wo er selber Kinder hatte und dann nach Hause kam und ein sehr guter Familienvater war, das kann ich mir nicht vorstellen.
The defense strategy was to prevent the Nazi defendants from testifying.
Weit über 100 Sitzungen hat das Gericht nun hinter sich. 3-mal in der Woche beginnt pünktlich um 8:30 Uhr die Verhandlung. Sie dauert bis 16:30 Uhr, unterbrochen nur durch die Mittagspause. Wie immer werden die Anwesenden von Richter Hofmeier namentlich aufgerufen. Häufig schon kam es in der Vergangenheit, die meisten Angeklagten verweigern fast immer die Aussage. Die Kameraderie unter den SS-Männern hält auch noch in der Hauptverhandlung. Keiner belastet den anderen. Und das sicherste Mittel dafür, Aussageverweigerung.
At no point did Borger accept personal responsibility, claiming rather that he was only following orders. In 1965, 20 years after the end of the war, he was sentenced to life in prison and died in 1978 when Ursula was 7 years old. Despite never having met her grandfather, Ursula bears the mantle of her grandfather's legacy with pain and confusion, often struggling to speak about it, so overwhelmed is she by the gravity of her grandfather's crimes.
Und wieder wusste ich nicht, mit wem ich darüber reden soll, wem ich das jetzt erzählen kann, weil ich mich so geschämt habe, dass ich eine Enkelin von Wilhelm Borger bin. Ja.
In 1992, the psychologist Dan Baron, born and raised in Israel, the son of German Jewish Holocaust refugees, organized what became the first encounter of sons and daughters of concentration camp survivors with sons and daughters of Nazi perpetrators. Samson Munn's participation in these workshops became the model for the work he would continue in the Austrian encounter.
Since 1992, I've been involved in several different dialogue projects. Sons and Daughters of Holocaust Victims, meeting with sons and daughters of Holocaust perpetrators. And I decided that I had an emotional responsibility, and so I decided that I would create a dialogue myself.
Altaussee is a destination of reconciliation for the descendants of Nazis and Holocaust survivors to come together for the Austrian encounter.
These were not randomly chosen people. These were people chosen who were open to have discussion, open to speak, and open to listen.
Under the terms granted to ensure the integrity of the dialogue, we were given unprecedented access to the Austrian encounter.
Umgekehrt sehen, dass Deutschland einen Gewinn hat, wenn sie anerkennt, dass ihr Nachfolger oder Nachfahren.
Der Grund war der, dass ich circa 10 Jahre vorher mir die Frage gestellt hat, ob mein Vater ein Mörder war, weil er als Nationalsozialist im Zweiten Weltkrieg.
It was the first time of my life, so I was 49. That I got a chance to tell my story to people who were willing to listen. And in the end, Samson, he took me in his arms. And I think that was one of the most healing moments in my life, just to be embraced and, yes, accepted. And, yeah.
There was no religious orientation. This was not a psychotherapy session. There was no fee. There was no historical bias. There were some ground rules. People had to agree that, in fact, the Holocaust occurred. People had to agree that, in fact, Jews were mostly victims. People had to agree that, in fact, Germans were mostly perpetrators.
It's not their guilt, but it's their responsibility to remember the history and also to talk about stories which were suppressed.
For a dialogue to be utterly genuine, it occurs best when there is little or no agenda. So the people there, their lives are the agenda.
And my father is responsible for, and that's hard to swallow. It's important to bring my daughter because as a family to connect between the past, the present and the future, because from death comes hope, from destruction comes creation.
I feel very honored to be walking through these gates and to be able to come out of these gates alive, as many people haven't, but I'm also very sad. So it's a mix of emotions.
Here, at the site that memorializes the cruelty and atrocities of Hitler's regime, there is a stillness and quiet. This from The Black Hole of Auschwitz by Primo Levi, Italian writer and Auschwitz survivor. Auschwitz is outside of us, but it is all around us. The plague has died away, but the infection still lingers, and it would be foolish to deny it. The rejection of human solidarity, obtuse and cynical indifference to the suffering of others, abdication of the intellect and moral sense to the principle of authority, and above all, at the root of everything, a sweeping tide of cowardice, a colossal cowardice which masks itself as warring virtue, love of country, and faith in an idea. The past cannot be unwritten, but through their dialogue and public engagement with this painful history, the participants hope to create a new narrative. For this reason, in 2010, Ursula and Bettina participated in Repair the Future, a gathering between generations in Weimar.
I have a heritage that comes from Nazis and anti-Nazis, and I had to deal with it my whole life, or I chose to do it, and I think it would be very healing for a lot of Germans to face up to that situation, to be encouraged. Dass da vielleicht noch mehr Leute in meiner Position, also nicht unbedingt mit so einem Namen, aber jeder hat ja irgendwo in der Familie jemanden, der Täter war damals. Diese komische Sache, unsere Familie, da haben wir ja Liebe auch mitbekommen. Also haben wir Liebe und dann Mord und Totschlag gleichzeitig. Was macht man denn damit? Naja, also es ist eine längere Geschichte, die ist nie zu Ende, glaube ich. Aber ich hoffe, dass das sehr viele andere, vor allem Deutsche, von uns, der nächsten Generation, dass das vielleicht als Beispiel hilft, da mal reinzugucken.
The painful legacy of this time still shadows the lives of the descendants, as it shadows all of our lives. When confronting the darkest darkness, the impulse is to look away, but only if we hold our gaze and reside with this terrible truth can we move forward.